Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
So let's chat through the papers with Michael Heaver and Matt Zarb-Cousin then. And a lot of those front pages, as we could see, dominated by Brexit. And the Sunday Telegraph leads here with an appeal to some Remain Tory backbenchers or Tory MPs, back Brexit or get Corbyn. So who's delivering this warning?
So this is Damien Green, Theresa May's deputy, basically trying to rally the Conservative MPs who aren't behind Brexit to backing the government on the bills and the parliamentary battles that are coming through. And obviously, following the disastrous election, it's a wafer-thin situation in Parliament now, obviously with the DUP propping up the Conservatives. And it's a rallying cry, and they're basically saying, look, if you don't back Theresa May on Brexit, you may actually see Jeremy Corbyn and Labour come in, potentially take down the government completely. I mean, that is how fragile the situation now is. We've had the parliamentary recess. This is now becoming the battle in Parliament for Brexit.
Well, that's right, and we've got the repeal bill being discussed, that bill that sees the transfer of EU laws into British laws, and Labour does want to put forward some amendments, doesn't it? So how much backing do you think it might get with that?
I think it will get... I think that they're right to be concerned that the moderate or pro-EU Tories would back it, not because they want to block Brexit necessarily, but because they want a meaningful vote on the final deal. And I think the only way you're going to get that meaningful vote is if you remove from the government's gift the date on which we Brexit, and you have to put that before Parliament then. And that's what Labour's amendments are about. It's about ensuring that Parliament remains sovereign throughout the process and at the end has the final say on when we leave the European Union.
Interestingly, Caroline Flint, who Labour MP, also supported Remain on the front of the Sunday Telegraph as well, making the point that Labour can't be seen basically to have ignored the result of the referendum and just been opportunistic and trying to cause problems for the government, on a partisan basis, and basically saying that Brexit has to be backed by Labour. And I think a lot of people that went and voted Labour at the general election did so, thinking that Jeremy Corbyn would respect that vote and move things forward. And if we're now hearing things from Keir Starmer and Tom Watson potentially about staying in the single market and the customs union, that certainly, I think, it's going to go down very, very badly with a lot of Labour.
Do you think that's right? And there are lots of Leave supporters who are also Labour supporters. Do you think they'll be worried about the stance that Labour is taking?
Well, if they are, then they shouldn't be, because what Labour's saying is that if what we'll do is we'll stay in the single market and the customs union on a transitional basis if we can't get a free trade deal with the EU within the 2 years, within the 2-year negotiating time frame. And the reason we do that is to ensure that the economy doesn't crash and that there's no impact on jobs, there's no impact on people's livelihoods. I think that it's important that we keep in mind that if we were to stay in the single market and customs union beyond a transitional period, then it would be on the basis that we could curtail freedom of movement. That's what Labour said. They've been very clear on that.
And we've got, in this article, Theresa May being quoted as saying that blocking the bill could precipitate Britain falling off a cliff edge and that Parliament must play its part. We also know that David Davis, of course, who's leading the Brexit negotiations for Britain, has written in The Sun on Sunday. We don't have that paper in yet, but he's having a go at Labour. He's accusing them of threatening to delay, bog down and defeat the government's repeal bill. But if you look at the Observer front page, they're suggesting that those appeals to the Tories to stay on side may not necessarily be heard.
Yeah, a former minister, Conservative minister, I think, on the front page of the Observer, talking about potential challenge to Theresa May, to some disharmony growing if they try and come down hardline on those Remain supporting Conservative MPs. But frankly, I don't think Theresa May and the government have a choice. I think they've got to get every Conservative MP virtually to back them that they can. The numbers on this are so tight. And I think painting it out as bringing down the government potentially and putting Jeremy Corbyn in number 10, is that serious? Theresa May's incredibly vulnerable position.
Is it that serious? I mean, could this trigger a general election? I mean, she said she's going to stay in the job until the next election. Is a general election really a possibility, do you think?
Not off the back of this, I don't think, because no one's saying we're going to block Brexit. Everyone's saying that, what we want is a meaningful vote on the final deal. That's all we're saying. I don't think this can necessarily bring down the government. I think that the problem is that they've invoked Article 50 early. They've handed the negotiating timetable the power to dictate that to Brussels by doing so. I think that the way they've handled the negotiations so far has been shambolic, and I think now what we're seeing, we'll take a step back from all of this, is David Davis and the Tories briefing out that Labour are trying to block Brexit. It's complete hysteria. It's fake news. Really, they're just trying to distract from the fact that they're handling the negotiations so badly.
And talking of the negotiations, one of the big sticking points, as has come to light this week with a rather tense news conference with Michel Barnier from the EU, has been still the lack of agreement over the Brexit bill, which is supposed to be one of the areas that they need to get through before moving on to the more substantive trade talks. The Sunday Times claims that there is a plan to pay £50 billion towards that Brexit bill. The government are denying this, we should say, tonight. But what does this article suggest? What do they think is going to happen?
I mean, they're suggesting that there is going to be this 50 billion. It'll be paid in increments. And we know this week there's been talk from the EU of 100 billion euros potentially. That was pushed back by Whitehall officials. But we also know in a poll this week that came out that only 9% of people in the country, whether they voted leave or remain, actually think the bill of 40 billion or more is acceptable, and 75% of people don't. So the government here need to listen, I think, to the public. Any big handing over of tens of billions of pounds is going to be incredibly unpopular, and this plays into the wider Brexit negotiations, I think. You can only let the EU and Brussels bully and cajole the government and Britain so far before you simply say your behaviour is appalling and we're perhaps not going to do a deal
Although
afterwards.
the EU's argument is you committed to this money and you need to see it through, and you can't back out of that now, and we're not going to talk about trade talks until you agree anyway. So is there an argument for the government thinking, well, just as a matter of practicality, we need to pay something in order to move on?
Yes, I think that we're in this position because David Cameron put the decision to the British people. The British people delivered a result. That has to be respected. We entered into the negotiations, I think, too early because we didn't have a pre-negotiations or anything like that. And now we're on their timetable. They're saying, hey, you've got to pay this, otherwise we're not going to talk about trade deals. And we have put ourselves in this position. And the fact that they are going to have to pay this, I think, in order to even try and negotiate a trade deal, means that they're going to have lied to the Conservative voters at the last election when they promised they wouldn't be paying an exit bill.
OK, let's move on to a couple of NHS stories you were keen to talk about. Here's one inside the Sunday Express suggesting that one cancer specialist is talking about NHS, what do they call it, health tourism.
Yeah. So it's Dr. Marion Thomas, leading cancer specialist, basically saying that he believes 1 in every 20 patients that he treats now is a health tourist, and that it's costing the NHS about £2 billion a year. And there's no doubt that the NHS, in terms of the cost to it, in terms of health tourism, it's spiralling out of control. And it's one of those things that increasingly we see, an overstretched NHS by a soaring population, mass migration driving 65% of that, the new figures. I mean, the population surge, we've seen doctors this week saying they're leaving the industry because their workload is going up and up and up, the population's out of control, and I think this is directly linked, the NHS crisis we're seeing, with the mass migration policy that's been continued over the last few decades.
Well, let's just put it in perspective. I think £2 billion is about 0.3% of total health spending. And it's very difficult to know who is a health tourist, in the sense that, are they coming to this country just to use the NHS, or are they here to work, or have they been injured on holiday? It's very difficult to actually put a figure on that. But a few hundred million can be recouped back through the EEA under the European Insurance Health Card. I think this is a bit of scaremongering from the Sunday Express, which is sort of what you're used to, really.
OK, and we are going to return to the other story that's at the top of that page as well after the break. But let me just very quickly bring in the other health story that you wanted to talk about, which you will have to talk me through. It's a double-page spread inside the Mail on Sunday.
Yeah, so this is about the NHS burying 19,000 suspect deaths. So the real concern here is people are dying and they're not being recorded, and therefore it's very difficult to know then why people are dying and what the reason for that is. It's been buried by the government. Professor Jarman said that these unexpected deaths going unnoticed will leave the NHS patients unacceptably at risk. So a very good investigation.
OK, and more on that, no doubt, will emerge. But in the meantime, we are going to take a break. Coming up after the break, we will go back to the issue of North Korea. Featured here on that page we were looking at just a short time ago, Kim Jong-un, we are told, according to the North Korean state news agency, has tonight inspected a hydrogen bomb, they say. We'll have more on that and lots of other paper stories coming up. You join us as we go through the morning papers with Michael Heaver and Matt Zarb-Cousin. Welcome back to both of you. And we are returning to North Korea as promised. This is inside the Express, this particular story. But just to remind everyone that just this evening we've heard that the North Korean state news agency is reporting that Kim Jong-un has inspected what it claims is a hydrogen bomb able to be mounted on a new intercontinental ballistic missile. This article takes a different tack because clearly this article was written before we had that news. Yeah,
this article basically talking about the deal that Donald Trump struck with South Korea, allowed them to have bigger missiles and new military hardware, basically to put pressure on North Korea. But sadly, as we've seen tonight, it doesn't seem to be much logic when it comes to Kim Jong-un. They're now talking about hydrogen bombs and all sorts, and it just shows you how this situation is sort of developing and changing at such a rapid pace now. You've got missiles being, flown all over Japan, all the rest of it. Every day now there seems to be something going on with Kim Jong-un and this North Korean regime, who, let's not forget, I know we sort of look at him and he's a sort of chubby joke. This guy's the closest thing to Hitler alive. They've got Nazi death camps in that country. They're killing massive amounts of people. They're now firing missiles all over the shop. This is a serious, serious existential crisis the world is facing. And I think Donald Trump's doing a great job in bringing an international coalition together to bring massive pressure on North Korea, and we may actually have to go militarily on this.
I don't think that North Korea ever wanted to start a nuclear war, or I don't think they've got a death wish. I mean, I think if you look at what Raymond Tanter said with the US National Interest think tank, he wants Washington to treat him with respect as a leader in everything they do. The show of strength, the parades, parading all of their missiles and weapons is for that very reason. I mean, I think that what's happened there is probably inevitable with the deal with South Korea and what Donald Trump's negotiated. I think that was always going to happen. But I do think that it's interesting how, as this has played out, people, the public opinion about nuclear weapons, whether they make us safe or less safe, has really shifted towards less safe, because it does escalate these tensions when people have nuclear weapons. If one country doesn't have them, they want to get them, and I think it can make things worse a lot of the time.
OK, we're going to move on to other. We're trying to rattle through a few stories if we can. This on the front of the Sunday Times. We've dealt with their Brexit bill story, but there's another story here. 5-year-olds wear hijab as school uniform, they say, on the front page.
Yeah, I think this is an absolute disgrace. Thousands of state primary schools are allowing girls as young as 5 to wear the Muslim religious headscarf. I mean, most 5-year-olds are thinking about if they want turkey twisted or chicken nuggets for their next meal. This is clearly being imposed on them by families. It's completely unacceptable. It shouldn't be allowed. And yeah, we've got sort of female Muslim campaigners, church leaders and academics all extremely worried about this development. Why are girls this young wearing the hijab?
Well, we don't know how many 5-year-olds are actually wearing the hijab or how many primary school children are indeed wearing it. It's the issue here is that primary schools allow them to wear it if they want to, and I don't think you're supposed to wear it. I don't think you're supposed to wear it until you've reached puberty as a girl. So I doubt there are many young girls wearing it, but perhaps Ofsted should look again at what primary schools permit as part of uniform.
OK, and just to whiz on again, try and pick up with another story that you've picked out, which is obviously Theresa May has said that she wants to take the party into the next election. She intends to, but the Mail on Sunday has been asking questions about whether Tory voters want that and who they might like to see if they don't want her.
Yeah, no, I certainly think this is a poll worth listening to as well, because it's been done by Survation, who actually, when it came to the election, were the ones who were pretty much spot on or closest to it. And yeah, I mean, they showed Boris Johnson as the firm favourite both amongst the public and Tory voters. Interestingly, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's been dismissed, and it sort of reminds me of the Jeremy Corbyn thing. The guy's way out there, he's never going to make anything, he's never going to come to power, and he seems to be building some real momentum out there in the public, and especially with Tory voters.
Mogmentum.
Mogmentum, they call it.
I really hope you're right, honestly.
Well, you'd love that, wouldn't you?
Oh, absolutely. If he becomes Tory leader, then it will be Labour hegemony forever.
Well, there was a lot of conservative activists saying that about Jeremy Corbyn once upon a time. Who knows what's going to happen in politics? But another key number just to pull out of this, is it unthinkable that May will fight the next election? 39% of Tory voters now say yes. That is something that she has to rapidly deal with and bring down, because if there's uncertainty amongst Tory voters and the general public, her credibility in terms of enforcing party discipline, as we talked about earlier, for things like Brexit, is severely weakened. So those numbers they need to work on and get down very, very quickly.
I don't really care much for the electoral fortunes of the Conservatives, but I mean, I think the best chance they've got is if Theresa May stays on until the end of the negotiations, and then however that plays out, they just dump everything on her, and then she steps down, and then a new leader takes over, and they can maybe start again. Because I think, as we've seen in the last few months, these negotiations are going to be a disaster, and the way they're handling Brexit is obviously hugely irresponsible. Calling an election in the first place is irresponsible, and I don't think her credibility is ever going to recover.
OK, we're going to talk triplets finally. A story that you found inside the Mail on Sunday, 200 million to 1 triplet miracles.
Yeah, I mean, they've done exactly the right thing there by addressing them all the same, and long may that continue.
It's a nice touch, isn't it?
It's a nice touch. You definitely have to do that if you have twins or triplets. And we were just trying to think about what other things might be 200 million to 1.
And a Lib Dem majority, I think, the only thing we could come up with. So.
Vince Kay will be weeping hearing you say that.
Sorry to break the news to you, Vince.
Yeah, sorry, Vince.
Fantastic, and they're great shots, aren't they?
They
Good to see you both. Thanks very much indeed.
And now to the front pages, and shock horror, there's a bit of politics on them. There's the Sunday Telegraph. Tory rebels are told, this is the looking ahead to those Commons votes, back Brexit or you'll get Jeremy Corbyn, a line I think we will hear a lot of. A less helpful line on the front page of the Sunday Times there for Theresa May. Theresa May secretly agrees to a £50 billion Brexit deal. I'll be able to ask David Davis if that's true or not. But it also says 70% of voters don't want the Prime Minister to fight the next election. Those are stories picked up in the Mail on Sunday, but their main story is they've got this memo they call a bombshell memo from Sir Linton Crosby, always described as Tory election guru, who warned, according to them, Theresa May very clearly ahead of the last election that she was taking one heck of a risk in calling it, and she ignored that memo, says the paper. Lots more on that later on. And finally, there's the Observer. Of course, an anti-Brexit newspaper. Furious Tory MPs reject May's threats over Brexit votes. Those are the May's threats that you saw on the front page of the Sunday Telegraph. So politics is just back, but it's moving very fast indeed. Caroline Flint, let's start with the Mail on Sunday splash.
Yeah, I will do. I mean, it's interesting about the headlines because you have most of the broadsheets are focusing on Brexit, but a number of the tabloids are focusing on what's happened to Wayne Rooney. So there's two worlds in opposition here, Brexit world and Wayne's world, and that says, I think, a lot of the public, actually outside of elections, politics is a minority sport. But back to this memo, because there's an awful lot today about
I thought for a horrible moment you're going to ask me to talk about Wayne Rooney.
No.
Thank the Lord for that.
I think we'll steer clear of that one, Andrew. But in terms of this memo, which has been leaked, it's a memo from Linton Crosby warning Theresa May against calling an election. And it's quite interesting for a number of reasons. One, because Bridget and others are going to be talking about the fact there's an awful lot of pressure on Tory backbenchers to back the Prime Minister. She had the election because she wanted to make her situation more secure, and that hasn't happened. But the other thing about it, of course, is Linton Crosby got a huge amount of bad press over his part in that election. I think this is about him redeeming his reputation by saying you shouldn't call it. And if you do have it, focus on the economy, because again, the Tories didn't do that either. So it's really about him making sure his footnote in history is clear and corrected.
I can kind of smell the reek of scores being settled.
Yes, definitely. Big time.
I think so. I think there's a lot of hindsight analysis that's going on at the moment. I remember when that election was called, the local elections took place a few days or a week later. We picked up seats like the West Midlands and Teesside that we would never have expected. We just recently won the Copeland by-election. So she was doing very well. All of what we're hearing now is really just people revisiting it. It's all hindsight. It's all hindsight. If she had done much better than that, no one would be talking about this memo and it would still exist.
And Kemi, because you're a Tory MP, I kind of think I know the answer to this. But Theresa May says she wants to fight the next election. The last one wasn't an exactly pitch-perfect campaign, if I can put it that way.
No.
Are you really relaxed about her doing the same thing again?
I personally, I am. And I think that, many people will disagree, but fighting an election is mutual consent. It's something that you decide mutual consent with your party and also with the country. And I think the way she answered that question was absolutely right. We are in the middle of some of the most difficult negotiations that the country has faced. And the idea that she should have responded by saying, oh yes, I'll probably go in a couple of years' time, it would just have triggered discussions about leadership. It was the only thing she could have said, and it was the right thing.
She could say,
and it was the right thing.
But she is wounded, as we all know.
It is interesting, isn't it, that all this settling scores over the last election brings us to the Sunday Telegraph headline and the Observer-related one about what's going to happen in Parliament. Back Brexit or get Corbyn. Well, the idea after what happened in the last election, that there's going to be a new election around the corner, not very likely.
It's interesting because Labour keeps saying, there will be an election coming soon, there'll be an election coming soon. But unless the Tories break apart completely over Brexit, and we can talk about that, it's very hard to see how it could possibly happen.
Nonetheless, this is going to be the story of the week, don't you think?
I think that slogan is going to go viral. It's going to be repeated ad nauseam.
It will, and it's a shame because I know, from personal experience, that we are more united than ever before. There will always be a few people who disagree. There always will be, but they're talking themselves up to be more than they are. We're very united.
Given the numbers, there only needs to be 7 Tory MPs who disagree and vote with Labour to cause real problems for the government.
And I think it's also the tone, and Theresa May so often misses the tone that's needed for dealing with events. And firing this off this week is going to get the backs up of a number of Tory MPs, as we've seen them quoted in the papers today.
Well, we haven't really talked very much about the Labour change of position, which is about a transitional deal during which we stay inside the single market and the customs union. And you've welcomed that in a piece you've written, I think, for the Sunday Telegraph,
yes,
Caroline. But there are lots of people in the Labour Party who think, yeah, hey, this is our chance to avoid Brexit entirely. It goes on forever. Tom Watson has said it could be permanent. What's your message to them?
Well, I don't think that can be the case. I mean, I said, over a year ago now, that the idea that we wouldn't have to have transition plans was nonsense. And we had Brexiteers saying, oh, we know we can just go. Some saying we could, just finish it all in March 2019. And then there were others on the Remain side who seemed to think we can have our cake and eat it. We can be full members of the single market and the customs union. And in some respects, some of those are taking from what Keir Starmer said, the idea that somehow this will allow us to reverse the decision. I totally disagree with that.
So you disagree with Tom Watson on this?
I disagree that it can be a permanent position. Yes, I do, because we are leaving the European Union. And actually, as my op-ed in the Sunday Telegraph makes clear, is in Keir's own words in his article a few weeks ago, he says that we are exiting the European Union. We will exit in March 2019. The transition is a transition. However, it is completely reasonable that Keir should point out that actually, whilst we're in this transition, being in the single market and the customs union until things are resolved has to be the case. But he recognises we can't be full members and change freedom of movement, and we have to change freedom of movement.
And that's part of the theme of the David Davis.
It is, and I mean, obviously, David Davis, you're interviewing later on. He's talking about, Labour's only motivation has been pursuit of chaos. I do think probably there are some colleagues who want to think about ways that they can delay the inevitable. But I also read in the bottom of David's article that for my part I will work with anyone of any party to make it happen. Now I think one of the faults of the government is they haven't been open to working cross-party in a sensible way. And here's an opportunity, maybe you could ask him today, he could ask Keir Starmer to actually be part of the discussions about how we leave the European Union and maintain good business and good opportunities for our citizens.
But if he is opening the hand of friendship, will you, for instance, back the government in this vote?
Oh, well, I'm very clear that I'm not going to try and disrupt us leaving the European Union. Having said that, there are legitimate questions to be asked as we take this bill through Parliament, and that's fair enough, but I'm not going to be involved in wrecking for wrecking's sake. I don't think that's the right way forward.
Some of Keir Starmer's specific worries about Henry VIII powers, whatever it might be, you would share, but
I would share that, yes, I would share that. And I think, as we've seen in a discussion just before Parliament rose on the nuclear agency, Euratom, there clearly are some of these issues to be sorted out. Let's not forget, though, Andrew, is part of this bill is actually adoption. It should be called the Great Adoption Bill, because actually we're going to be adopting wholesale all the frameworks that currently exist, and then looking to how we're going to actually make sure we move forward. So I think it's a language and tone in this is vitally important, and I absolutely think that the government were daft a year ago to talk about somehow we should leave with no deal at all. I don't think that's helpful language.
Kemi, you've chosen Damien Green, Deputy Prime Minister now.
Yes.
the great survivor, has written a piece in the Sunday Telegraph. I can remember him years and years ago thinking that his political career was on the way down. And he's suddenly right at the top again,
Yes.
enjoying it hugely. But he was a Remain campaigner, of course, a very passionate
Yes.
Remain campaigner.
And that is why I selected it, because I think there is a narrative about Brexiteers versus Remainers, which is no longer the case. The vast majority of people in the country want us to get on with this, which is why it's so unhelpful to be talking about leaderships and when the PM is going to go. And I think people like Damien are working very hard to try and get the best possible deal. He talks about, what's happening in Northern Ireland, and more so that if we don't all come together to make this happen, certainly in the Tory party, then we will see a Prime Minister Corbyn, and that's definitely not something
What
that
you
we want to see. No,
Very good.
absolutely
Okay,
not.
now, before we leave Brexit, we're going to come on to other, possibly even more important matters in a moment, Bridget. But before we leave Brexit, I must just ask you all about this £50 billion Brexit bill that the Times, Sunday Times suggests here. Kemi, this is something that's a real problem for the government, because there is going to be some kind of bill. We don't know what the figure is, but at the Tory party conference at the beginning of next month, Tory supporters of Brexit and Tory opponents of Brexit will all want to know what that number is, won't they?
Yes, and I'm surprised that a number has come out, because it was just a couple of days ago that the EU was saying that they hadn't had any discussions on numbers and that we were keeping all our cards close to our chest. But whatever the number is, there will be some people who disagree with it, and it's just the nature of negotiations. And I think that October is a reasonable time for us to have come to a conclusion. Davis can tell you a little bit more about that, but it is definitely something that is achievable.
I have a quiet prediction about that conversation. I think I know how it's going to go, but we'll see.
I'm very suspicious about that headline and that number.
We'll see. Now, Bridget, some news, of course, happens so quickly, doesn't make the Sunday papers.
That's right.
And you've taken the BBC News on the tablet.
That's right. This is
there.
North Korea's new test, which happened much too late for the papers, but it is on the news websites and the BBC websites. In fact, the most recent story is that North Korea has hailed it as a perfect hydrogen bomb test. It's certainly been very big. It's its sixth one. Experts always say be a bit cautious about whether they really got the capacity for a hydrogen bomb. But the North Korean leader was shown inspecting what they claim is a hydrogen bomb. They say they can miniaturize it and put it on a missile. We've just had that missile over Japan. It reminds us yet again that they have a capability which is growing. And what's more, they are not cowed by any warnings from the international community, certainly not the American president.
Because
so what do we do about it?
We're at this sort of stage where people are becoming almost relaxed. Oh, it's another North Korean nuclear test. It goes on and on. They find another missile, yet another missile. But they're ramping up what they're doing, aren't they? And they're showing greater capability. And the big question, I suppose, is there anything really the West can do?
Well, I mean, it is worth making the point that they're not crossing red lines. They haven't actually fired a missile over Guam, that American island. They sent it over Japan. This is another test. They've done quite a lot. So perhaps they are being more calibrated than the defiant, flamboyant show that we see. But the question is, what do we do? Actually, there's a useful article today in The Observer, which is by an academic at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Because the key to North Korea is, how could you possibly have a military solution when North Korea has the trump card of the South Korean capital, Seoul, being just south of the border with millions of people in it? Anything that the United States or anyone else did, the counter-strike would immediately be on Seoul, which takes us back to the fact there has in the end to be some containment through diplomacy. And the key to that is China. And for that, we need to read China's mind carefully. And this is a really good article explaining what China's concerns are. And he makes the point that it's not that China's worried that there'll be an implosion and many refugees. It's not that they're worried that the Korean peninsula will then become an American foothold. You could make the counter-argument that once North Korea is not there, the Americans would no longer have a reason to be there. He says the reason is internal Chinese politics and the nervousness of the Communist Party leadership that if there's turmoil in North Korea, that could affect stability in China. So I think it's really important for us to understand this if we're going to move to the next step, which is, try and enlist the Chinese in something that can get us out of this dangerous position.
I want to bring you back in a moment to talk about another nuclear story. But before we do that, Caroline, you've got to teach us.
Well, of course, the children are going back to school
Yeah.
next week, and the story in The Observer is about teachers £5,000 a year worse off on the stories. This is because clearly that their wages haven't kept up with inflation. And worryingly, in this story as well, is that recruitment targets have been missed for 5 years running, and 2 years in a row now more teachers have left the profession than joined. I mean, this is worrying because although the government will say there's more teachers than ever before, there's been a bulge in pupil numbers. So it hasn't kept up with that, and that's why there's a real terms increase in funding per pupil. But, you know, all the talk about Brexit, there are these domestic policy issues which have to be attended to as well and shouldn't be forgotten.
And in terms of domestic worries, there's not much worse than this one that Bridget... This is... Now, you've written a book on the whole Cold War experience, which has come out, but this is a kind of Cold War type story. We remember Protect and Survive when we were terrified of nuclear attack. And people are still thinking about the possibility of a nuclear attack here.
It is funny, Andrew, having immersed myself in the half century of the Cold War, how these themes come back. This is called When the Bomb Drops. It could have been a title out of the 1950s. The threat of nuclear war because of North Korea. And although the article makes the point that, you know, we're a very long way from a bomb being dropped from, say, North Korea on Britain, nonetheless, in our updated world, what are the provisions? And interestingly, what he's found out is that instead of it being the broadcasting service and the dulcet tones of Peter Donaldson,
R.I.P.
sadly, telling us all to be calm and carrying on, nowadays it might well be through our mobile phones, because the government would be able to contact everybody and also turn our mobiles into a one-way signal. So we wouldn't be able to ring friends and family to make sure everyone's all right. Instead, we'd wait for instructions and warnings from the government. One other little nuance that I really liked is if you have to go somewhere a very long way from radioactive particles and try and cleanse yourself of them. And in doing that, you can wash your hair with shampoo, but don't use conditioner because it will bind radioactive material to your hair.
We always like to cheer
people.
We like to cheer people up in this news review. We like to cheer people up and give them useful, practical information. Thank you all for that. Very interesting.